Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are joining us from. Welcome to our special public session, Strategic Shift in Northeast Asia, Future Policies and Strategies, an event that is co-organized by the Center for Strategic and International Studies based in Washington, D.C., and the CHEY Institute for Advanced Studies based right here in Seoul, Korea. My name is Son Ji-ae, a professor at Ewha Women's University. As we end the year of this very turbulent year, we are faced with the daunting task of dealing with some fundamental geopolitical changes affecting this part of the world. Fortunately for us, we have today a group of highly influential minds to help us navigate these turbulent waters. So let's get started. First off, we'd like to invite President Park In-guk of the CHEY Institute of Advanced Studies to give us his opening remarks. President.
Hi, good morning and good evening. Welcome to all of you joining us online from Korea and the United States as well. First, I would like to thank President John Hamney for bringing together world-renowned experts from United States. With the upcoming inauguration of Biden administration, the U.S. will likely revitalize a more traditional bottom-up approach to foreign policy. Against this backdrop, I hope that our in-depth and interactive discussion today and further debate will help shape the Biden administration's policy toward Northeast Asia, especially the denuclearization of North Korea and ROK-US alliance. In this vein, I highly appreciate that CSIS has proposed to launch this joint commission to form a collective intelligence and wisdom for the future of this region. I can overemphasize the importance of the foresight to look into the next 25 years geopolitical landscape on the Korean Peninsula and Northeast Asia. As opening the session, I'd like to suggest the three pillars of geopolitical dynamics in Northeast Asia to center our discussion on. First, the future of US-China relations under the new Biden administration. A second, prospect for the North Korean denuclearization and nuclear proliferation beyond the Korean Peninsula. Third, the future of multilateralism in terms of provision of global public goods. As to the US-China relations, it is a general observation that Biden's China policy will not dramatically change from that of President Trump, because tough on China has become a bipartisan rhetoric in Washington and not likely to fade out anytime soon. But on the actual possibility of decoupling between the two economies, we have seen various controversial arguments on whether the full decoupling is possible or not. What's more important is to keep these bilateral relations from repeating the disastrous history of extreme protectionism in early 1930s by falling into the so-called Kindelberg trap. As eloquently articulated by Professor John Ai, this concept points to the miserable outcome of failing to provide global public goods by superpowers. In the early 1930s, the United States replaced the UK as the hegemon powers, but US then was not ready to provide global public goods. As a result, global system collapsed and the world fell into depression, genocide, and even World War II. With this historic lesson in mind, our discourse on the future of US-China relations must focus on how to reaffirm two powers' role as a source of global public goods. On the prospect for North Korean denuclearization, we must recognize that Trump administration has given top priority to North Korean nuclear issues, which had been on the back burner since President Clinton's signing of the Geneva Agreement framework with North Korea in 1994. North Korea's virtual abidance to the moratorium on nuclear and missile testing deserves our attention as an early harvest. Now, we are faced with a question on how to sustain the North Korean issue as a top priority or deal break issues in the new Biden administration. North Korea will likely launch provocations if and when they feel they are not receiving enough attention from the new US administration. In case of such North Korean provocations, what kind of additional sanctions could be feasible and effective? That's our second question. The other question is on the format of future negotiation with North Korea. As a candidate, Biden has mentioned that US will work with various stakeholders, including China, implying that he will pursue a multilateral approach to solve North Korean issues. We can think about having the 4-party talks or 6-party talks, even though Pyongyang has some reluctance toward 6-party talks. But it should not be forgotten that North Korea has already committed to the denuclearization in 1992 joint declaration of denuclearization of Korean Peninsula between South and North Korea, and the historic joint statement of 6-party talks in 2005. We must consider it as a critical bottom line for future negotiation with North Korea. Lastly, on the future of multilateralism, the new Biden administration is expected to re-engage the US with multilateralism in a host of global issues like climate change, public health, nuclear non-proliferation, human rights, etc. Especially, Biden as a candidate wrote in one of the local news outlets in South Korea in October that he will engage in a principled diplomacy in dealing with denuclearization of North Korea, implying, I think, he would put more weight on various aspects of North Korean issues, including human rights. 6 years ago, Professor Joe and I visited our institute in Seoul to give special lectures on Is American Century Over? Today, I look forward to listening to his insight on how the geopolitical landscape in Northeast Asia will unfold for the next quarter century. I also vividly remember General Brooks' powerful speech at the 4th Security Summit at Harvard Belfer Center. And he was right to point out that North Korea's pursuit of nuclear capabilities will place our concern into more precarious dimension, the possibility of nuclear chain reaction in Northeast Asia and beyond. I'd also like to highlight that the Commission will produce an outcome document sometimes in early next year upon consecutive consultations between CHEY Institute and CSIS. This report, that either published jointly or separately, will reflect core elements on what will be converged during further discussions among us. Thank you, and I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, President Park. He has actually given us a lot to think about in our coming discussion with our host of speakers. Next, we would like to welcome Victor Cha, Senior Advisor and Korea Chair at the CSIS, who is with us virtually to give us his opening remarks. Victor, are you there?
Yes, Professor Sun, I'm here. It's very good to see you. It's good to see Ambassador Park, and the participants from both the Korean and the US sides of our commission. I think President Park did a great job of framing our conversation for this morning in Seoul, this evening in Washington, D.C. Let me just say that from our perspective at CSIS, we are quite excited to undertake this project with the CHEY Institute. It comes at a very important and critical time in terms of US policy and South Korean policy, both on the peninsula and in Asia, with a change of administrations here in the United States. In South Korea, the government in its last couple of years in office. So we look forward to having a very healthy exchange between the two sides over the course of the next few weeks, talking mainly about the topics that Ambassador Park mentioned, and that is the future of US-China relations and its impact on the Korean Peninsula, the future of multilateralism and US alliances and partnerships around the world, including in Asia. And then, of course, North Korea, the problem of North Korea. So we're very much looking forward to that, looking forward to the discussion this evening. But let me not take up any more of our valuable time together, and let us begin the session by introducing our first speaker. And so our first speaker today will be Joseph Nye, and I think Professor Nye really needs no introduction, but let me give a proper introduction since we are doing this for the public audience today. So Joseph Nye is the University Distinguished Service Professor and former Dean of Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He received his bachelor's degree from Princeton University, was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, and earned his PhD in political science from Harvard. He has served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, Chair of the National Intelligence Council, and Deputy Undersecretary of State for Security Assistance, Science, and Technology. He is the author of many books, including The Power to Lead, The Future of Power, Presidential Leadership, and the Creation of the American Era, and Is the American Century Over? He is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the British Academy, and the American Academy of Diplomacy. In a recent survey of international relations scholars, he was ranked as the most influential scholar on American foreign policy, and Foreign Policy magazine also named him one of the top global thinkers. And perhaps most important for our conversation today, he is also a trustee of the Center for Strategic and International Studies. So without any further delay, let me please introduce Joseph Nye. Joe, over to you.
Thank you very much, Victor. It's a pleasure to be with CSIS and the I'm going to touch on all three pillars of Master Park, the US-China relationship, and the future for multilateral and alliance relations. But let me start with the US-China relationship. I think it's proper to say that it's in its worst condition that it's been in 50 years. And many people in Washington are talking about a new Cold War. I think that language, though, is very misleading because unlike the real Cold War, where we had no trade or social contact with the Soviet Union, we have high degrees of interdependence with China. And the interdependence is not just economic and social, it's also ecological. There are things that are happening in the world globally, transnationally, where we can't solve the problems acting alone, and China can't solve the problem acting alone. If I think about the current pandemic, it's a good example, but I would also note that climate change is similar. And these are areas where essentially you can't think only about power over other countries, you also have to think about power with other countries. And that's why I've called the relationship between the US and China a cooperative rivalry. it really is much more complex than the situation we had with the Soviet Union in the real Cold War. Now, I think the Biden administration will make a difference in the US-China relationship, primarily in terms of style and predictability. I don't think it's going to have the back and forth, up and down type of volatility that you saw during the Trump administration. But some of the issues that Trump raised are going to continue to be difficult and tough issues for Biden. For example, I don't see Biden allowing Huawei to build 5G telecommunications in the US, and I don't think we should. I think it is a security threat. And similarly, on issues like freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, where the Hague Tribunal has found China wrong, I think we will continue our freedom of navigation operations and should do so. Now, what are the implications of all this for South Korea, and what does it mean? Well, I said before that South Korea is in some ways a victim of geography. It's a wonderful success story, a very successful country, but it's stuck on a peninsula between giant neighbors, China to the north, Japan to the south, and Russia to the northeast. In those circumstances, the proper security strategy for South Korea is the one that it's followed, which is you borrow power from a distant power, which has no territorial interests or aspirations, to balance the local powers and protect your own independence. And that's the importance of the US-Korean alliance, which is it allows Korea to have that degree of independence. Now, it's not always easy. It creates problems, as we saw with the Chinese reaction to the deployment of THAAD. There are times China would love to see this alliance go away and try to bully South Korea to make it behave better in China's view. But basically, this is the right proposal for what you're going to see as a security strategy for South Korea. And fortunately, that goes very close to what the Biden administration is thinking. Biden has talked about the importance of alliances and multilateralism. So in that sense, I think you're going to find that the chosen defense and security strategy for South Korea is one which is going to mesh more closely with the new Biden administration than it did with the outgoing Trump administration. Now, that still leaves major problems. For example, what to do about North Korea. Basically, we are going to have to try to recruit China to put more pressure on North Korea. We still have the long-run objective of denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, but in the meantime, we have to strengthen deterrence to prevent North Korea throwing its weight around, and we have to see if we can reach interim agreements which can restrain and restrict some of North Korea's bad behavior. So in that sense, I think we're in a situation where the relationship between the US and China is complex, but it also has a very strong effect on South Korea. And that's going to require us to work more closely between Seoul and Washington to make sure that we're working on the same page to get this done, to hold a common position. And of course, in the background of all this is the importance of, in this cooperative rivalry, of making sure we don't have mistakes, that they're not situations where you have a crisis. And that's going to require much more attention to crisis prevention as well as crisis management techniques. Now, what does that add up to? To conclude, it adds up to a situation where the US, I think, is both able and willing to provide those global public goods that Ambassador Park referred to. We have the capability, and I think what we're going to see in public attitudes, as measured by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, is an interest in 70% of the American people of having an outward-oriented cooperative foreign policy. And that's been very much the attitude of the incoming Biden administration. So I think the prospects for being able to deal together between Seoul and Washington with the problems that we face regarding Pyongyang and regarding relations with Beijing are good. And the question now is to make sure we keep South Korea and the United States in a close alliance, which makes us able to deal with these problems. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Nye. I mean, you gave us a lot to think about again. Let me just ask you a couple of quick follow-ups to what you've just said. First of all, I would like to take you back to what President Park talked about in terms of the Kindleberger trap. It's sort of what happens when there are global power shifts that are going on, especially these days with the United States and China. The question he asked, which I want to sort of ask you as well, is how do we avoid this kind of the void of not having a global power that provides global goods?
Well, I think Mr. Park expressed it very well. The danger is that if the largest countries don't take the lead in providing global public goods, nobody else will. Everybody else free rides. And the fact that China is getting stronger means that in areas like climate change, where China produces more greenhouse gases than the United States does, or in areas like the World Trading System, where China has essentially tried to tilt the system with state-owned subsidies to companies and with coercive intellectual property transfer, we're going to have to get a rules-based system where the Chinese and the U.S. work together along with other countries to create that system. So the Kindleberger trap, I think, that we should worry about is that essentially if the U.S. lets down its lead and China doesn't pick up its responsibilities, we're all going to be the worse off for it.
But as you point out, you know, in the past 4 years during the Trump administration, there has been a sort of stepping back from the United States in terms of the global leadership and the provision of global public goods. And China has actually done its best to sort of try to fill the gap. And now that you point out, as you point out, with the Biden administration, they will be coming back in terms of trying to put together a more outward policies. Do you see a sort of a competition for hegemony between the United States and China, and especially in this part of the world?
Oh, yes, very definitely. That there is great power rivalry, and we can't ignore it. And that's why it's important, as I mentioned earlier, to stand up to China on areas where it's taking positions that are clearly wrong, as in freedom of navigation situation in the South China Sea. So we have to realize that in this cooperative rivalry that I mentioned, you can't ignore the rivalry part of it. But the hard job is to make sure that we don't let the focus on the rivalry prevent us from engaging in the cooperation. That's not always easy. It means doing two things which are quite different simultaneously. But I think we have the capacity to do it. And I think that's the right way to frame it, as a cooperative rival where we have to combine power over others as well as power with others. It can be done. It's not an easy task.
And you address South Korea, the position and sometimes difficult positions of countries like Korea that are sort of stuck in the middle. How does Korea try to navigate this kind of international position in which, even though what you call is a cooperative rivalry, South Korea is put in a position of having to choose one side over the other in many instances?
Well, South Korea has an admirable record. I mean, of its economic growth and its real democracy, where governments actually change as a result of elections. And it sets a model and example for much of the rest of the world. It gives South Korea a great deal of soft power. In addition to that, South Korea has to maintain its hard power, which is to make itself strong enough that it doesn't tempt aggression from the north, either north of the 38th parallel or further north. So in that sense, South Korea has to be able to stand up to China, stand up to Pyongyang, and at the same time, if the Americans make unreasonable demands, it has to stand up to the Americans. So I think South Korea has the capacity to do that. But I also think that the values and security interests of South Korea and the United States are closely enough aligned that while there'll be differences from time to time, I don't see any fundamental ruptures because of the long run security interests that both countries have.
Thank you. Just one final question, because you just raised the issue of soft power, which I am very interested in. There's always been talk about the limitations of China becoming a global leader, and one of the things that has been cited is its lack of soft power. Do you think that in the past years, China has been able to gain in this area? I mean, is China a bigger soft power than it used to be?
No, I don't think so. I think they've certainly been trying. They've been investing billions and billions of dollars to try to become better at soft power. But they have two fundamental problems. One is when you have territorial disputes with your neighbors, it's hard to be attractive, which is what soft power is about. You can't kill Indian soldiers on the border and set up a Confucius Institute in New Delhi at the same time and expect to be attractive. The other major problem that China has with soft power is its insistence on tight party control on all activity. A great deal of a country's soft power comes from its civil society. In the United States, from universities, from foundations, from Hollywood, and so forth. In Korea, from K-pop, as well as the impressive democratic record I mentioned. China, when you get somebody in civil society who's really a genius, like Ai Weiwei, what do? They put him in jail or put him in exile. There are limits on what China can do with soft power. And I think that shows when you look at some of these indices of soft power, such as the Soft Power 30, which is constructed by Portland and in London, which shows China down around 27 or 28th of the 30 top countries.
Thank you for clearing that up. Thank you, Professor Nye. You gave us a lot to think about as we move forward in Northeast Asia. Next, we'd like to invite a former Prime Minister of South Korea, former Prime Minister Lee Hong-gu. He's also the chairman of the board of the Seoul Forum for International Affairs. Prime Minister Lee, could you give us your remarks about the topic that we are addressing today?
Well, again, I'm delighted to attend the second meeting of our series, and particularly welcome our American friends. I see Professor Nye and Dr. Henry, and of course, Victor Cha. But I'm delighted General Vincent Brooks is back in Seoul, at least through this conversation. And of course, I welcome my colleague, General Chung Seung-jo from our side. I think there are two words or main theme which has influenced us in the last 100 years in our part of the world. The first word is imperialism. I have said on several occasions in the last 10 years about the imperialism today. After the financial crisis of 2008 and so on, somewhat concerned about the revival of imperialism. Because in the latter part of 20th century, in the early part of 21st century, we had this tremendous trend of globalization. And for example, under the leadership of two Secretary Generals, Kofi Annan and Ban Ki-moon, United Nations took a strong leadership in bringing almost universal economic development, which was rather remarkable. But coming into this century, everybody was not satisfied because in spite of all this positive development, you can see a continued inequality nationally and internationally. Nationally, of course, is between rich and poor in every country. And internationally, it's between rich countries and poor countries. So there were tremendous unhappiness. And I said, I don't know whether it makes sense or not, but one big problem is in this type of situation, we saw in last 10 years or so, revival of nationalism in major powers, the big powers. Earlier, after Second World War, former victims of colonialism were the main force for the nationalism to bring independence and so on. But I think in recent years, major powers were really the big actors in revival of nationalism. Singled out the United States and China. Both of them were suffering what I called from a nostalgia for empire. In case of United States, looking back, good old days of 1950s and 60s and so on, those were the years much better than what you have now in the United States. At least that's what many people seem to felt. And in fact, the election of the President Trump signified this revival of nationalism, but more importantly, revival of nostalgia for empire. Let's have a US of old days revived. Likewise, in China, with Xi Jinping concerted effort to revitalize or revive the Chinese nationalism, that is, Chinese empire. And every Chinese looked like had some nostalgia for empire. So this explains the situation. And the Chinese-American contest along that line, Professor Nye already had explained. And a couple of years ago, I attended a meeting in Beijing with some of the former leaders. And we invited the mayor, you may say, the administrator of Hong Kong, before it was transferred to China from UK, Mr. Tung Chee-hwa. So we all asked, what does he think about these problems or questions? And here is what Tung Chee-hwa said. You don't have to worry too much about this Chinese-American rivalry, because from Tung Chee-hwa's standpoint view, both Americans and Chinese are basically commercial people. And these commercial people don't really go into fight. They always find some ways to find a solution which will be maybe not always equally, but more or less fairly divide the benefits of compromise. So there may be some dangers, but nevertheless, he is rather optimistic about the future of US-China relations. What I just wanted to put into the conversation. Now, revival of major power, nationalism or nostalgia for empire, we have to think about Russia. And not many visits, but several visits I had going to Russia. I asked some of the people, not really officials or others, and the impression I received was they all liked the current leader, because, again, they thought Mr. Gorbachev had given away the status of empire from the Soviet Union in the global politics. And in some sense, the current leader had restored it. And what I'm saying is, this satisfied the Russian people's yearning for the, or as I said, nostalgia for empire. And well, this kind of situation. Now, I mentioned Russia because with the election of the president-elect Biden, I think Russia is coming back. And recent weeks, of course, the Russian hacking of various agencies in the United States has become a major issue, but also somewhat belatedly, but Putin has sent his message of congratulations to Biden, and he specifically said we could cooperate and could engage in constructive conversations. This, I think, signals what I call maybe a new trend, that is a return of major power engagement in resolving some of the many strategic problems. And when we say many strategic problems, we certainly have to include the Korean Peninsula. So what I am hoping, and not only myself, but the New York Times, I think 3 days ago, in a very long article about the Russian attempt to force certain things on the United States. For example, maybe there will be a new START talk, strategic arms limitation talk between United States and Soviet Union. And some of the early days of the 1960s and 70s, when US and then Soviet Union, then Russia, cooperated to bring some of the strategic resolution about strategic problems between those two major powers. So it's a coming back of this type of geopolitical consideration and geopolitical strategic condition. And I'm hoping that when we talk about North Korean nuclear problem, we were too much concentrating on China, but we really haven't paid that much attention to Russian influence on North Korea. So I'm hoping that Biden put in traditional, or at least going back to decades, the efforts of USA and Russia to end the Cold War and bring a new age to the world. And somehow they have to revive this. And in resolving these problems, you can talk about the North Korean nuclear problem. It's not a local problem because, after all, both Russia and China are one of the the members of so-called P5 at the United Nations. The P5, the major powers, have a responsibility to maintain peace in the world and to support major decisions of the United Nations toward that end. And which means that, among other things, those 5 countries have major responsibility to uphold non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. And that's the problem Chinese had more or less ignored, but I think to pressure or to persuade the Chinese, we need, I think, US, Russia cooperation and kind of new major power relations to change the general atmosphere. Now, having said all this, do I have a couple more minutes? Or?
Yes, a couple more minutes.
Okay. So in some sense, this is what I had said, I think, last time, that is, maybe we are bringing back somewhat old notion of geopolitics. Professor Nye already mentioned the fact that whenever you talk about geopolitics, Korea is a prime example of how you handle your problem as well as your neighbor's problem through a proper understanding of geopolitical setting and the problems they are in. So with this new, hopefully new relationship between US and Russia under the Biden administration, we may be able to change the overall structure of major power involvement in these problems. And that's my hope. Finally, I said imperialism was one of my main concern, but going back to 19th century, Korea had become a victim of naval, colonial, or imperial attempt, Japan, China, and others. Our first president, Dr. Syngman Rhee, he was only about 29 or 30 years old, was sent to Washington as a King's Hojong's special emissary to persuade the US to do something about this. I think this was 1905. And he was able to meet President Theodore Roosevelt, but he didn't succeed. First of all, the reason he was able to have that audience or that meeting was because so many American missionaries who, as a group, played such a decisive role in Korean history, had sent so many letters to the Washington, the White House. He was able to have that meeting, but his appeal didn't get a positive response because just before he arrived, there was a so-called Japan-US secret agreement about how to deal with the Philippines and the Korean Peninsula problem. That's, of course, now just a page in the diplomatic history, but it was a very, very disappointing situation. But that was 19th century. Come to the 20th century, US played decisive leadership role in both World War I and World War II. And as a result of all this, Korea was liberated. And furthermore, only 5 years after the Second World War, the Korean War broke out. And this is my last remark again, I made this last time. Korean War broke out largely because I still feel that the ignorance on the part of Kim Il-sung, Stalin, and maybe a little bit Mao Zedong, ignorance of the United States. They, all three, didn't think that the United States will intervene with their military immediately when that war broke out. And that ignorance had caused the great deal of sacrifices to all parties. Now, 70 years have passed, but what I'm afraid is there are still quite a bit of ignorance on the part of these countries about the United States. I'm glad that at least election of 2020 had somewhat reestablished the proper image of the United States. And I hope everybody, including the countries I just mentioned, will understand this and will bring a new era in diplomacy and in the major power politics. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prime Minister Lee. I think it was very interesting that you pointed out the possibility of Russia's involvement in the future multilateral approach, especially to the North Korean nuclear issue and the geopolitical framework for a lot of the discussions that is going on right now. We'd like to then move back to Washington, D.C. And we have Dr. John Hamre, the President and CEO and Langone Chair in American Leadership of CSIS. Dr. Hamle, are you there? You have the screen and the mic.
Yes, I'm here. I am here very much. Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. And let me say how grateful I am to the CHEY Institute and to Ambassador Park for their leadership. This is really an important, very important initiative, and I'm so grateful that they have taken the lead to do that and invited us to be a part of it. And I say thank you. And my special thanks to Joe Nye and Vince Brooks for joining us tonight. Of course, Victor Cha, who's the real expert at CSIS on Korea. I was asked to address 3 questions tonight or this morning, your time. First was, what did the election say about America and American democracy? The second question was my view about the nomination of Lloyd Austin to be the next Secretary of Defense. And the third question is, what do I think will be the Biden administration's approach to our competition with China? So I'll be brief on each of these because I'm very interested in your questions. First, Biden won a decisive victory. I mean, there's no question about that. I mean, there were over 6 million more Americans that voted for Biden than voted for Trump. President Trump is waging a very strange, kind of a campaign to try to undo the election. In recent days, it's had some very, very peculiar, dimensions. I mean, even suggesting the military ought to organize, new elections in states where Trump lost. I mean, this is really very strange and undemocratic, honestly. But I think if you step back to look during this bizarre 30 days, the American judicial system and the political leaders at the state and local level have stood very strong for the integrity of the election. Over 80 judges have ruled against the lawyers, Trump's lawyers, who have tried to argue that there were problems with the election. Over 80 justices, and over half of them were appointed by Trump. I mean, so the judicial system held very firm and honestly about the election. And if you look at the statements made by, Republican governors and election officials, they all stood by the legitimacy and honesty of their elections. So despite President Trump's very odd campaign, it's a little like somebody in the 6th grade that didn't win the class presidency and then claims it was a flawed election because he just didn't win. I mean, but all the facts show that it was an honest and fair election. And I think that broadly speaking, the American public understands that and accepts that. So I don't think that there is a fundamental question about the integrity of our democracy. I do think there is going to be a question about our resolve as a nation when we're so divided. Now, if you do look at the actions, especially of the Republican Senate during the last year, they've rejected an awful lot of Trump's initiatives, in the Middle East, in pulling troops out of Afghanistan, pulling troops out of Korea, etc. They've rejected Trump, but we're still pretty much in some ways a divided country about America's future directions. And I think this is where President Biden will be He's a very traditional intellect. He embraces the main trajectory of America's foreign policy, that America should be an active participant in the international system and a leader where it can lead. But he's going to be challenged, and we'll see how it unfolds. I personally suspect he will be successful in his foreign policy. I think our domestic policy is going to be rancorous and very difficult, but I think our foreign policy is going to be solid, and I think that President-elect Biden is going to do well. Now, very briefly on retired General Lloyd Austin, and I don't know him honestly, and Vince Brooks does, and so Vince would be better positioned to address this. I don't know him, but I do know his reputation. He's considered to be a very fine officer, a solid, fine officer, and with a great deal of personal moral courage and direction. Now, he's not an outspoken individual about policy directions. That he didn't do that when he was in senior positions in government. And what I think that means is that we're likely to see very much a team effort with a Biden administration. I don't suspect you will see big public disputes between the Defense Department and the State Department, for example. I would think that you're going to see, a real team effort on the part of everybody to work collaboratively in an integrated way. I don't think we'll see radical changes, in the trajectory of foreign policy, and especially in Asia. I think that you will find a very solid embrace of the traditional framework that we've had in place in Asia for many years. I think it is a question how they're going to address North Korea, but I don't believe you're going to see any radical departures, for foreign policy, especially in Asia. Finally, just a word about Biden's approach to China. This is the greatest question they're wrestling with, and I should put this in context. Back in 2011, 2012, when President Obama basically gave his famous speech of pivot to Asia. Now, there was criticism at the time. Did we really pivot? Did we really move much, et cetera? But that was a historic declaration, because it was the first time in 300 years of American history when we said that Asia was our first priority, not Europe. It's really hard to overstate that. I mean, it's really significant development. And I believe that represents a consensus today. I think that the foreign policy and defense community still views Asia as the premier security question that America is facing, and it will be the first priority. I also think that the Biden administration will embrace the direction that came out of the National Strategy Review that Jim Mattis conducted when he was Secretary of Defense, which basically shifted our defense planning away from counterterrorism back towards peer competition with great powers. That, I believe, is also going to be the case. I think you'll see that being continuity. So I think you'll see a fair amount of continuity in America's overall direction. Asia will be our first priority and highest priority, and peer-to-peer competition is going to be the primary focus, not going to be on issues of counterterrorism. Now, I do think the Biden administration is going to work hard to try to find areas of collaboration with China where they can. Now, I think most people feel that that's a limited set of topics, but they're going to try to find them. And they're going to try to work to try to find constructive things we can do with China. At the same time, I believe they're going to be more outspoken about the human rights issues and the democracy issues and challenges that China presents the world. And early on, President-elect Biden has talked about having a summit of democracies. I think that's going to have a very significant theme, be a very significant theme of the Biden administration, and it will certainly have overtones that that Beijing will resent. And I think that'll be a challenge for us to manage. But do I think that we're on a collision course with China? No, I don't think so. I think both countries know that there's great peril in letting things get out of control, and it's going to be important, I think, for both of us to try to find ways to manage it. But I do think you're going to find a very steady hand, and you're going to find a hand in President Biden-elect Biden, that values allies very strongly. Let me stop with that, and because I think I've gone too long.
Thank you, Dr. Hamre. I think it's very interesting. You talked about the U.S. trying to find a balance between collaboration and rivalry with China and its emphasis, future emphasis on Asia. Now, we talk about the fact that in terms of focusing on Asia and the emphasis on democracy, they will call upon the U.S.'s two greatest democratic allies in Asia, which are Japan and South Korea. And there's a lot of talk about the increased need for trilateral cooperation between Washington, Tokyo, and Seoul. But as you know, relations between Seoul and Tokyo are really at a very low point. And in the past, the United States has actually played a role in trying to improve relations between Seoul and Tokyo. And actually another nominee, the Secretary of State, Mr. Blinken, who actually I believe you know better than the Defense Secretary, because I think he was also related with CSIS. Yes. He's known to actually have played a role in terms of getting South Korea and Japan back to a sort of a semi-normal state. Do you believe that in the future he will go back to playing that role, or the United States will try to play that role in some way?
Well, I think it's widely felt here in foreign policy and defense circles that each one of us, Japan, Korea, the United States, each one of us is weakened if there are divisions within us. I think there's a view that our overall collective interests and our individual interests are much strengthened if we can work together. I think that's a very profoundly shared view here. So yes, I do think there will be an effort to try to bridge across these great divides, and there's an enormous divide, and I understand it very well. Americans are not. We're not a country that has a strong historical identity. I mean, everybody that came to America left someplace else, and so we don't really have a strong sense of history shaping our own identity. But I do understand how important that is in Korea and in Japan, and these sentiments are deep and they're very real. But if we say, does relitigating the past help us with our collective future? I think we're going to argue that it's better for us to focus on improving our collective future.
Let us hope that our collective future does bring us more peace as well. Let's go back and come back to Seoul. And we would also like to invite Professor Yoon Young-kwan, who's a professor emeritus at Seoul National University and also a former Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Professor Yoon, you have the mic.
Thank you very much, CHEY. And first of all, I'd like to express my gratitude to Dr. John Hamney of CSIS and Ambassador Park In-guk of CHEY Institute for organizing this very timely and important conference and inviting me. As we know, intensifying US-China competition has put many countries in the world in difficult situations. And I think South Korea is a country which has been most negatively affected. Korea is a divided country, and South Korea has a very hostile neighbor, North Korea. And South Korea is located very close to China and dependent on that country economically. However, I think the nature of the South Korea-US relationship is qualitatively different from any other bilateral relationships that South Korea has, in the sense that ROK-US relationship is that of alliance. Having said that, I'd like to make a few policy recommendations to both governments, the United States and South Korea. First, I'd like to suggest to both governments to establish a special bilateral commission composed of high-level officials as well as experts to discuss the future of bilateral alliance. You may call it Commission for the Future of US-ROK Alliance. As we know, our alliance was created 67 years ago, and we are living in a totally different world nowadays. By updating our alliance, I think we can reduce possibilities of some misunderstanding and miscommunication between two allies. Now I have a few recommendations for our government, South Korean government. Many Koreans feel relieved to watch President-elect Biden putting much emphasis on the value of alliance in recent months. Actually, two most important keywords, I think, of the Biden administration seem to be democracy and alliance. For example, the identity of South Korea as a state is based on such values as democracy, freedom, and multilateralism, open market, etc., etc. So I wish South Korean government work closely with the Biden administration in this field of value diplomacy, promoting democracy in other parts of the world as well. For example, it would be a good start for the South Korean government to actively participate in the summit of democracies that President-elect Biden is planning to hold in the near future. In this context of value diplomacy, I also hope the South Korea-Japan relationship would improve. Japan is another ally of the US, and that country is also a democracy. So it is natural for us to try to improve the relationship in the future. And power shift from Mr. Abe to Prime Minister Suga has provided an important opportunity to turn bilateral relationship into a positive one. Another area where South Korea can work closely with the United States is global diplomacy, focusing on overcoming some global challenges. For example, South Korea could accumulate some experience and expertise in overcoming such global issues like poverty, pandemics, or climate change, etc. South Korea may work closely with the United States in dealing with these problems, for example, in Indo-Pacific or in other parts of the world. Also, South Korea may work together with the United States in the field of high-tech areas too. I have a few suggestions to the US government too. I hope the US policymakers pay more attention to South Korea's unique geopolitical dilemma. As Professor Nye already mentioned, South Korea, or Korea as a whole, has been suffering the tyranny of geography. And historically, whenever there was military conflicts on the Korean Peninsula between the maritime power and continental power, Koreans suffered national catastrophes. And most Koreans nowadays do not want to repeat it again. In short, Korea is not unlike Japan or Australia. Those countries are not, peninsula country, surrounded by big powers, and they don't have North Japan or North Australia. So I think a customized alliance strategy towards South Korea will work more effectively for the United States than one-size-fits-all alliance strategy. Many observers acknowledge that Korea is probably the most dangerous region in the world. DMZ is just 35 miles away from Seoul, and Seoul is within range of several thousands artillery attacks from North Korea. North Korea's nuclear program is a direct threat to South Korea. So South Koreans do not have much room to pay attention to security matters in other regions. This is why Koreans think that establishing a permanent peace structure on the Korean Peninsula is the most important and urgent matter. In other words, without having a substantive improvement in the South-North Korean relations and the stable Korean Peninsula situation, South Koreans would feel uncomfortable to be deeply engaged in other regional conflicts. In my view, this is not a matter of whether there is a progressive government or a conservative government in South Korea. In other words, the more actively the US cooperates with South Korea in resolving the North Korean issue, the easier for South Korea would be able to cooperate with the US on other regional issues. For example, Biden administration may be preoccupied with urgent domestic issues in next year, and it may not have much political capital to invest to resolve North Korean nuclear issue. In that case, I think it would be very prudent if the US government could send a message to the United States quietly or publicly. For example, a message saying that the US would recognize the Singapore agreement 2 years ago and is serious about resuming negotiation on the nuclear issue soon. I think that will help North Korea for the time being, not provoke, not make any provocation for some time. So I think it is important for both countries, South Korea and the United States, to cooperate on the nuclear issue too. And many observers have arrived to the conclusion that the maximalist approach on the nuclear issue could not work. So if the US government takes a more pragmatic, step-by-step approach, there would be more hope for a successful diplomatic solution of the North Korean nuclear issue. Pressure is certainly important, but that alone cannot work, I think. Without some form of political engagement of North Korea, a negotiated solution would be difficult because of very low level of mutual trust between the United States and North Korea, and North Korea's deep sense of insecurity. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Yoon. I think you pointed out many interesting aspects in terms of the bilateral commission between the U.S. and Korea, and you sort of pointed out Korea's unique geographical situation in this part of the world as well. But I do want to sort of ask you the fact that the new Biden administration is going to do what is going to provide a more principled diplomacy as their foreign policy undertones, does mean that South Korea, which is this government, which is trying to improve relations with North Korea, will have to reconcile these efforts with the new administration's push towards a more emphasis on North Korean human rights, for example, or a push into North Korea that is more based on democratic principles. How does South Korea reconcile its present goals and what the Biden administration is also going to push forward for?
Yeah, that's very tough question and also important question. And let me explain this way. Whenever the issue of human rights condition in North Korea comes out, I feel heartbreaking. It's very painful to think about that issue. And I commend all the international efforts to pressure North Korea to improve human rights condition in that country. I think pressure is certainly important tool to influence North Korea's policymakers to change their policies or their thinking on this important issue. But again, I think if we want to be more effective in raising the level of human rights condition inside North Korea to higher level, I think we need some kind of political engagement in addition to pressure. What I'm saying is, as long as North Korea remains isolated from the outside world, international society, without having any linkages or channels to the outside world, actually it would be very difficult for us to influence North Korean policymakers so that they can change their attitude on this important subject, human rights. Let me show you an example. For example, in my personal view, the human rights condition in China could be improved significantly only after the diplomatic opening between the United States and China in the early 1970s. engagement builds some channels or linkages into the kind of isolated countries. And we can use those tools like linkages or channels through engagement for our purpose of improving human rights conditions. Thank you.
It does sound like you're talking about building leverage in order to get the final goal.
That's right.
Okay, now we'd like to go back to Washington, D.C. and invite retired General Vincent Brooks, who's the former commander of the U.S. Forces Korea, UN Command, and the Republic of Korea Combined Forces Command. Thank you, General Brooks, for joining us. You have the screen and the mic.
Okay, thank you, GA, and I hope everyone can hear me well. First, good morning and good evening, as all have said, to all of you ladies and gentlemen who are present and who are watching. I really am honored, as everyone has said, to be part of this panel and part of this commission. All of the members of the panel I know, both US and Korean, and I have great admiration and respect for each of you, and I'm just grateful to be on this panel with you to share some thoughts. So let me just try to add a few thoughts here, and in the interest of time, I'll try to hit three main points, and I'm going to, out of necessity, not explore them in great detail, but certainly I can go more broadly on matters that you want to dive into, GA, when we get into questions and answers. And that includes going shallowly into the military aspects. I'm going to speak a bit more broadly than that, but can always go into a deep dive if you want to. So point number one. My view is that progress on the Korean Peninsula must extend from progress in strengthening the Korea and U.S. alliance. It has to begin from the Korea-U.S. relationship. And as has been said, there are some residual points of friction that resulted from a transactional approach to alliance relations, and these have to give way to reconciling within the first 6 months of 2021. And I put that timeline on there because I believe that that is a very important window of opportunity. It reflects the first 6 months, the opening of the first year of the Biden administration, and it reflects the opening of the final year of the Moon Jae-in administration. And there's not time to waste. So if there's going to be alignment, it should happen quickly and get some of these alliance friction points out of the way. There's one example of a matter that awaits reconciliation, and there are several, but I'll call out specifically the Special Measures Agreement. In my opinion, this must be concluded and renewed soon, and certainly within those first 6 months. And it's my advice that the Special Measures Agreement, traditionally a 5-year agreement, now operating under a 1-year agreement that has expired, my advice is that it is renewed for a 3-year period this time. And that will free it from some of the gravitational pull of being timed for the next renewal afterward during a period of national electoral politics in either one of the countries. The 3 years should be followed by 5 years, and that will reset the renewal clock, and it will insulate this important agreement from the partisanship and nationalism that, in my opinion, skewed the agreement into its current impasse. So this is work that must be undertaken quickly and effectively. Point number two, the approach to North Korea, and this is aligned with certainly what Minister Yoon Young-kwan said. My view is that the approach to North Korea must continue to include pressure through sanctions and also international alignment. But it must also be, in my view, better balanced with an active approach to constructive engagement with North Korea. Now, there will be room for debate on whether this should be a bottom-up approach or a top-down approach, and I would submit to you that it will have to include at its heart a top-down approach. And this is because of the limited degrees of trust that Kim Jong-un has for anyone in his surrounding circle. A bottom-up approach will not be reflective of Kim Jong-un. And so as a result, I think that there will have to be some readiness to engage at the most senior levels very early, but a continuous engagement that allows then some fidelity to be built in the relationship from lower levels as time goes on. This may require, therefore, a hybrid approach. Now, within this engagement effort, I think that there should be a serious discussion about establishing a new relationship between North Korea and the two allies, US and South Korea. And if this is new from the viewpoint of North Korea, which should see it as a step away from hostility. And I think this is one of the matters that must be concluded pretty early through engagement. The US and South Korea both have to articulate the broad array of concerns that each country has for North Korea, and there are many, many concerns: human rights, missing persons, etc., up and down the line. There are many, many concerns. But having laid those out up front, my advice is that the alliance should not try to work on all of them concurrently. They cannot run in parallel. And that's mostly because North Korea can't handle it. And so recognizing who it is that will be across the table, I think, will be very important. And candidly, compartmenting issues is an approach that is well understood by North Korea. They do it all the time. So they get it when something is compartmented. We're going to work only on North-South relations over here. We're going to work on nuclear issues over here. We're going to work on other issues separately. So they have no problem with compartmenting, even after all the issues have been laid on the table. It's important to recognize that for North Korea, a new relationship comes first, and then progress on more substantive matters will follow. And I believe that the US and South Korea have to be willing to take a degree of risk on this. This is not an approach that is comfortable or regular from the perspective, especially of the United States. But there's some risk that must be taken by following this sequence. And if so, I think that that can help to create some momentum and some lubrication in the relationship that'll keep it from locking itself up, as we've seen happen on too many occasions in the past. And finally, on this point about the approach to North Korea, I think it must be viewed, as many have said, in the context of international relations with China. Now, often we talk about the US-South Korea relationship in the context of relations with China, but I'm suggesting that the approach to North Korea must also be viewed in the context of its relationship with China and obviously the alliance's relationship as well. And it prompts, in my mind, a few questions. And these are food for thought for the administrations to try to grapple with. Can the United States and South Korea create an alternative for North Korea in terms of its own economy and security? Can it? Can the relationship with North Korea reach the depth that is needed to truly determine the true meaning of North Korea's requested security guarantees? I think that North Korea is going to require some deep engagement in order to get to that level of clarity, and that on the way, there will be many things that seem to be the issues of security guarantee, but they're superficial. What is the real issue that North Korea is seeking? And that must be thought through in the context of their relationship with China. And can the US and South Korea, as allies, create essentially a new balance of power in Northeast Asia, of power and influence, really, when compared to the North Korea-China relationship? Remember, China has had great influence over North Korea's economy for a very long time. Up to 90% of the economy is impacted or controlled by China, and North Korea is a basket case. I don't think that's what North Korea is looking for as their future. But how do we help North Korea move in a different direction that creates an alternative to that, and yet leads to peace and stability on the peninsula? Point number 3, and this will be my last point. And this it gets to the much broader regional considerations, many of which have been many of the panelists have touched on already. And the key point is this: that the Republic of Korea must become bigger than the peninsula. It must. And that's not something that can wait much longer. That growth into being bigger than the peninsula, using the throw weight that is out there, both soft power and hard power, as Joe Nye said, I think it's important to begin to get a grip on this even now and begin to set the strategic conditions for that. First, as an ally of the United States, South Korea definitely has a challenging dual task of maintaining a clear focus on changing the situation with North Korea. But it also must look to the near abroad in the Indo-Pacific region, where South Korea's actions and influence are greatly needed. South Korea has so much to offer, as has been talked about. And it's common for South Korea to highlight the softer things that can be offered out there. And they're out there. South Korea is already engaged globally. But South Korea's strength in other areas must also be present. And that can come not so much in standing up against China. That may be necessary at some point, but that doesn't have to be the start point, but rather to support other allies of the US and other nations throughout the region, really running from Laos to Indonesia. Each one of them, each country in the region has some security as well as economic prosperity concerns, and South Korea has capacity to help in both of those areas. And so it's a direct engagement with countries of the region that I think is most important, not so much a standoff against China. I think that this will be done while South Korea is under some great pressure. There will be domestic pressure on how to approach this broader regional engagement, and there will be international pressure, particularly from the United States and also from China. But this further emergence of South Korea onto the world stage is, in my opinion, the opening of what will come after a changed Korean Peninsula emerges. And South Korea cannot afford to wait. It can't let the environment set without having impacted it in South Korea's interests and with relationships to the alliance. Now, of course, the US, as the ally of South Korea, has to work carefully with South Korea. It must help South Korea engage the region without displaying impatience or, more importantly, a lack of empathy. I think this has been highlighted as well. There is great complexity that faces South Korea, and the US must understand that complexity from South Korea's eyes as it helps South Korea engage the region. So as I close, let me just say that I believe that the next 10 to 30 years of this century will reflect a change, a permanent change to the existing international order. And I believe that that change is going to endure well into the next century. So like these dialogues are leading to, a strategic approach to what our nations wish for the mid-century to look like. What do we want the mid-century to look like? That must begin to emerge in the next 2 to 5 years while there's still time to impact the direction. So I'll pause there and see if you have any questions. So thanks very much.
Thank you, General Brooks. I mean, you gave us a lot to think about in terms of the approaches and challenges, strategic challenges that lie ahead for not only North Korea, but South Korea and the alliance as well. I'm not sure we'll have time to delve more deeply into these questions today, but there are certain issues that we have to discuss in depth in the future. Finally, we have retired General Chung Seung-jo, who is the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the Republic of Korea Armed Forces. General Chung, you have the floor.
Thank you, Professor Son. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to attend this excellent conference and to be able to see my old friends, especially from US, General Brooks, Dr. Victor Cha, Dr. Hamley, and also Professor Nye. And it is my deep appreciation. My long-standing question, since I was the Deputy Commander of Combined Forces Command, is whether the Iraq-US military alliance is working well or not. The official evaluation has been always okay. Ironclad, strongest in the world, and stronger than ever. It is same even today. However, in private dialogues, we can see some concerns. Actually, the poll conducted by Institute for the Korean American Studies in US in April this year showed 84% of the respondents believed that ROK and US alliance was not stronger than that of last year. We have some different thoughts about North Korean nuclear issue, wartime option transfer, SMA, combined exercises, stationing of USFK, live fire exercises, UN's revitalization, and military cooperation among ROK, US, and Japan, etc. Sometimes we have questions whether both sides really have confidence as the real alliance. As we are to have new administration in United States, I believe this is the right time to restore or normalize the alliance by confidence building through the fulfillment of responsibilities of alliance partners. The most important thing in this process is to share the same understanding to solve the pending issues. Please understand my presentation today is my personal view focused on the military perspective. First issue is North Korean nuclear threat. We cannot give up denuclearization of North Korea, whether it is CBID, FFVD, it must be the perfect denuclearization. North Korea is accustomed to survive under certain level of insufficiency. We need to have cooperation from international community, including China and Russia, to lay stronger sanction that North Korea cannot withstand. In a military perspective, however, we need to put more emphasis on the extended deterrence. We need to have a stronger deterrence capability, commitment, and posture. To enhance the capability, we need to have more detailed and tailored extended deterrence plan, hopefully to an upland level. We need to periodically exercise it by TTX, CPX, or FTX. The ROK also needs to equip more reliable capability, retaliation capability in a conventional way. The alliance needs to show the decisive commitment from working level to national command level with more ready posture of forward deployment of the capabilities and the shared nuclear decision-making process. We need to show our enhanced capability, commitment, and posture to not only the alliance, but to North Korea. Next is wartime option transition. We already have very good agreement of condition-based transition principle to hold on. The important thing now is to evaluate the condition objectively. I propose to operate external evaluation team to ensure the objectiveness of the evaluation. The alliance is evaluating the IOC, FOC, and FMC of future CFC. However, we must know that they are only a part of overall evaluation. Next issue is SMA. Some people of Korea were hurted when US side was reported to relate the amount of money to the stationing of USFK. It does not go with the spirit of the alliance and the spirit of SOFA. We need to agree that the alliance is mutually beneficial to both countries. However, when we see the spirit of SMA and ROK's enhanced economic capability, ROK needs to increase the amount to the rational level that both sides can accept. We also need to change the annual negotiation, as General Brooks already mentioned. I prefer 5 to 10 year negotiation, and the 3 years negotiation that General Brooks mentioned will be the good start of longer period of terms. It must not be the issue. It must not be the political issue, especially in a presidential campaign. Next is the combined exercise. I have an experience to serve in Iraq as the division commander under US-led National Corps. I remember we could conduct a mission without any crucial difficulties because my staff officers were trained to combine operation through frequent combined exercises like UFL, UFG, Team Spirit, or RSONI. Combined training is essential to maintain the readiness of the alliance. We need to resume the combined exercise. It is also closely related to ROC military's capability to lead the combined operation, which is a very important part of the conditions for wartime Afghan transition. The combined exercise will also contribute to deter any North Korean provocation. Next is the training facility for USFK, especially the fire exercise, live fire exercise. The lack of fire range influences very much to the readiness of USFK. Solving this problem is very important to give the stable stationing environment to USFK. I know that the Defense Minister Seok is working very hard to solve this problem. However, it is not the issue which can be solved by MND's effort alone. The President or Prime Minister should lead the trans-government efforts, coordinating with National Assembly to acquire the required training facilities. Next issue is the military cooperation among ROC, US, and Japan, as many colleagues already mentioned. In a military perspective, the trilateral military cooperation is very important to counter the North Korean threat and to maintain the regional security. The military cooperation between ROC and Japan is essential to maintain the ROC and US alliance. Although ROC and Japan have some difficulty issues, we need to cooperate each other while we argue each other at the same time. In this sense, the gisomia between two countries should not become the political issue. Next issue is the revitalization of UNC. When the concept of UNC revitalization was known to ROC public, there was some misunderstanding that UNC would function as another combat command in Korea theater of operation. As US side, including General Brooks and General Abrams, have tried hard to inform the fact, I believe many Koreans now become to understand the truth. UNC's #1 function is to maintain the armistice as the responsible entity who signed the agreement. In wartime, UNC will function as the force provider when other countries send any military support through United Nations. The people of both ROC and US need to share the fact that CFC, Combined Forces Command, will be the only one combatant command in KTO. We understand that the alliance is beneficial to both ROC and US. Sometimes we take it granted. However, it is not right. We need to put some effort to maintain it. The most important factor here is the perception of the national leaders, as well as their efforts to establish pro-alliance policies. The increased contacts and candid dialogue between the government officials and military leaders will be important to strengthen the alliance. At the same time, the civilian side efforts will be also essential to promote the alliance. Let me introduce two organizations. In 2017, Korea Defense Veterans Association, or KDVA, now led by General Brooks, was founded in United States, whose members are former USFK, CFC, and KATUSA since the Armistice Agreement in 1953. Same time in Korea, we established Korea-US Alliance Foundation, or KUSAF. The principal goals of both organizations are to strengthen the alliance. I expect these organizations perform the very positive functions in an active manner. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, General Jung. It is a rare opportunity that we have such forward-looking thoughts from the military, both from General Jung and General Brooks. My only regret is that we don't have enough time to be able to really delve into the very important issues that you both raised about the future of the alliance and between South Korea and the United States and the challenges they face. It is actually also regretful that we don't have time to really delve into all of the issues, the very important questions that all of you raised, that is really could each provide a fodder for thought for separate discussions many times in the future. Perhaps that is something that we look forward to in the new year. And you know, as we end this very, very difficult year, we are looking forward to really being able to think about the strategic future of Northeast Asia amidst the global power shifts that are going on right now. So with this, I would like to end today's session. Thank you everyone for participating and happy holidays. Thank you.